My name is Martin Parker, professor at the University of Bristol, very interested in sociodigital futures and particularly in terms of the topic of this seminar, colonialism in the digital age, the fight for a livable future. In an era of rapid technological expansion, climate crisis, and deepening injustice, how can we understand and resist new forms of digital colonialism? What alternatives might support a more just and livable future? Our speakers will offer critical insights and practical perspectives on these urgent questions. Now, we've got three fantastic speakers here today. I'll just introduce them before we begin. First of all, Dan McQuillan, who's Senior Lecturer in Critical AI at Goldsmiths, University of London, researcher with the AHRC Sustainable AHRC Futures and the ESRC Centre for Sociodigital Futures at Bristol, author of Resisting AI, an Anti-Fascist Approach to Artificial Intelligence, published by Bristol University Press. Second, we've got Iran Mansouri, Associate Professor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham, co-founder of the Critical Cultural Robotics Network and the Contentious Politics of AI, co-author of How to Be Anti-AI in the 21st Century. And finally, Patrick Brodie, Assistant Professor in the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin, co-author of From the Bog to the Cloud, Dependency and Eco-Modernity in Ireland, also published by Bristol University Press. So fantastic panel, really looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. Each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes, and then towards the back end of the hour that we've got scheduled, we'll be welcoming questions from our audience. So could I start off with you then, Iran?
Yes, sure.
Okay,
Let
you're going to
me
share
do
your screen?
the first. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, that means you get the tricky business of finding out how to share first.
Okay, so can you see my screen and can you hear me
I
well?
can. All good.
Excellent. So should I start?
Yeah, please do.
Just let me get. Oh no, sorry, technology. Uh,
You just unshared.
I know because I yeah
Okay.
I want to get rid of this, which I don't know. I want to get rid of this.
We
Okay,
can see what I assume is the first slide, Iran.
excellent. So I wanted to
Okay.
get rid of my face. So, okay, thank you so much for introduction. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and sharing a bit of my thought on the topic of this panel. So I'm actually a computer scientist. I do AI and robotic in my day job. That's what I pay my bills. And but as a result of that, I'm going to start my presentation with a one slide, a short story on the what is actually the origin of robotic. As I said, I'm a roboticist, and this is basically a quick reminder that the origin of robotic is in slavery. And then thanks to the brilliant book that my friend Tom Williams wrote on degrees of freedom, on robotic and social justice. And basically, he goes through the history of robotic and argues that robotics of today, due to history of their development, be they the engineering aspect of that or the cultural aspect of that, reinforce the interlocking white supremacies and patriarchal system of power. And it has this chilling quote by Joseph Engelberger, who is supposedly considered the father of AI. He once said, since we can't have a slave or kick around black people anymore, the robot serves that purpose. Cool. So let's fast track to today and let's see what LLM-driven or generative AI-driven robot look like today. In the research that we did recently with my brilliant colleague from CMU and King College London, we tested all AI model, the state of the art at the time of the publication, for a common service robotic task. And we concluded that, as you can guess, LLM-driven robot risk discrimination, violence, and unlawful action. It's a quite boring, very long paper. I don't recommend to read it because it says what is basically a lot of people here imagine. But let's go quickly. What is involved in making these very useful, intelligent, AI-driven robots? So first is the mineral extraction for AI hardware, which has, as we know, is a detrimental effect on the environment and is often carried out by workers in dangerous, unregulated, and extremely exploitative condition. From Taiwanese farmer and fishers whose livelihood are endangered by the aggressive expansion of wind energy to power the semiconductor industry, to illegal cobalt mining in Congo that can be sometimes carried out by even children. And this also expands to the other, people in Africa from different countries who simply may live close by the lands that soon become mines, thanks to the discovery of Silicon Valley company Cobalt Metals. It's quite actually huge and influential. And what they do, they're harvesting historical geological survey data from different parts of Africa and licensing their proprietary AI engine to mining companies to create what they call a Google map of mineral deposits. And it's quite grim stuff there. And I like to quote Stephen Cornford here, which he said, circular economy will not be forged from recycled metals, but recycled colonialism. So let's move on from the mineral extraction for AI hardware to AI content moderation, which is normally outsourced to precariously employed worker and who suffer from psychologically strain with little support, obviously as a result of their job. And many may be familiar with the story of Okini, who was the content moderator for a company called Sama, which is one of the OpenAI content moderator company. And the story was just, it was really quite, it became well known thanks to the brilliant book of the Karen Howe. So if you read these testimonies, which I'm not going to read it for because of the time, you will see the mental strain he suffered is actually horrendous. And in addition to AI content moderation, the data capture is also very exploitative. Maybe you are familiar with the companies like Object Vase, whose job is to employ people, sometimes quite a high-skill engineer, to and also with a relatively really low salary, to film themselves by folding item in a specific order that can be later used to feed AI method. And remember, all of this is for me making those sexist, racist, ableist, and frankly very dangerous robot that I mentioned earlier. And I wish all of those data capturing was for folding towels and things. And all this mineral extraction and data capturing could be actually put in place in a much more grimmer scenario, for instance, for the purpose of accelerating genocide through decision compression with AI, or as a case of recent war in Iran, killing more than 158 schoolgirls. So, of course, we have at least I don't have illusion what AI is and what constitutes in its production. In my opinion, AI is a venture capitalist fantasy, unfunded techno optimism that underpins the latest speculative bubble. And but if the history of capitalist development taught us one thing, that any technology that is developed for restructuring and transforming the global capitalist society is destined to be sharply contested, unstable, and crisis-prone crisis prone. So, from the bread riot to the peasant uprising to factory occupation to striking auto workers to Luddite to hackers. So the new capitalist technology has always been contested, and this time will be no different. And obviously, I'm not the only one saying that. So some of the panelists here, and there are really lots of books and articles and movements and things, and which I'm going through some of them. So, in our previous work that I've done with David Bailey, we wrote a paper on how to be anti AI in 21st century, overcoming the inevitability narrative. We were inspired by Eric Olin Wright, who wrote a book on how to be anti-capitalist in 21st century. He identified 5 ways, and from there we identify 5 ways to be anti-AI: taming, resisting, dismantling, escaping, and smashing AI. And I will very, very quickly go through these 5 category. So the taming AI, it requires the influence and adoption of the public policy measure in order to regulate, reduce, or avoid AI most excessive and concerning harms. So the premise that AI is mostly good, but we have to do through regulation prevent AI bads. And the famous example, it would be UAI Act. Different research centers at universities. Mine had 2 at least, I guess. For instance, even the big tech has safety and AI unit in Google and Microsoft, at least they have. And so if forced to tame AI is currently the most prominent form of, if we can call it, I'm not sure, anti-AI activities. And the problem, of course, in this category is, as you can imagine, the people who are involved with taming AI, they see the problem of AI as technical problem. So in order to fix it, they propose technical solutions, including some law and some policy. And so the problem is, if you reduce the problem of AI to a technical question, the most systematic issue related to capitalist logic and power relation would be basically unquestioned and addressed. And also is obvious that if the Google and Microsoft have safety and ethics centers, that is nothing more than an ethic washing. So let's move quickly to
2 more minutes around.
resisting AI would be about collective grassroots effort to protest against and prevent the most harmful, and this can be the campaign to no Palantir in our NHS, which is, in my opinion, very important one, or strikes such as the nurses strike in New York recently, or the kind of Luddite movement in California, which try to sabotage self-driving cars. Dismantling AI would see public policy, not only to regulate AI, but instead to prevent AI use altogether. So in rights framework, both taming and dismantling is basically, they see it as a role for a state. And we can see an example of that, EU staff ban from using AI-generated content, or the famous effort for a data center moratorium by Bernie Sanders and OC. And of course, this is really difficult to see what would be the incentive for the capitalist state to do that, because they need all of this for, make economic growth. And as we know, the UK, for instance, tried to streamline AI development in the UK economy. And as we know, we're going to live happy ever after that. Escaping AI is come from the name, is living alongside this new capitalist technology, but we allow for its effect to be evaded. And there is a really large rise in anagon lifestyle or gaming AI algorithm. Even with the developer in the tech companies, because they're forced to use AI, or the gaming the algorithm by platform worker. So we have to remember that escaping AI does not prevent its expansion, I guess if we don't have a plan for scaling up, escape has little wider societal impact, and there is a risk. And my second last slide, that would be a smashing AI, which require a revolutionary praxis that is able to transcend capitalism or to create a new non-capitalist technology that can be used for common good. That would be a radically different AI, an AI based on revolutionary mathematics that are not built around the furthering of alienation and quantification of human productivity. Or Dan is here, but his effort for decomputing a form of AI that is based for low power infrastructure, attempt to build AI around principle of relationality. So that we consider it as a part of a smashing AI. For Nick and Alessandro, for instance, that would be a new form of AI that yeah, it's a technology that would serve another type of social relation that is basically based on eco-communist circulation. So, given all of this form, another form of contestation that would not be maybe considered in this framework, that would be a limitation of our framework, we archive them in our network and make sure you subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which there is a long list of contestation from around the world. And David Bailey put a tremendous amount of work to circulate this, and I hope this contributes to the critical AI movement. And that's from me. I hope I'm not go much over time.
Tremendous. No, thank you very much. That was a wonderful start, around. Really, really helpful. Can I just ask before we move on to Patrick, given that you described yourself at the start as, a member of a computer science department, how do some of your ideas go down there in your workplace, which is after all, as you said, paying your mortgage?
Right. So unfortunately, there is not much overlap between the stuff that I present today between my day job. However,
Hmm.
I think the last category, what we call is smashing AI, if you're really serious about it, and if you, I mean, I personally believe that in not only the infrastructure and who owns the infrastructure of AI, but also the mathematics itself is problematic. And if we recognize that that is a problem, so the computer science department, not in the University of Birmingham, around the world, the people who think like me have a duty of thinking in new ways of computation. And I think that would ideally would be overlap. But as you can imagine, my university, and I don't think any university in the UK have zero interest in this line.
Indeed. Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Aran. That was a really, really great start. So can we now pass over to Patrick Brodie? Do you want to share your screen, Patrick?
Yes, let me just make sure it's working
Terrific.
properly.
I'll give you the 10-minute
Um,
warning.
cool. And is that
That's
looking
lovely.
okay on your end?
That looks
Awesome.
just fine.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for this. Thanks, Ron, for the great, yeah, sort of run through of some of the grassroots, especially models of AI contestation. Really, it's very inspiring for the type of work that I hope this is useful for. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be talking very much about resistance. I'm going to be talking about pretty doom and gloom political economy at a large scale type of things. But then hopefully at the end, I'll kind of zoom in also on some, points of potential around this. And just to say that this is building on work that I've been doing in the book that Patty Breslan and I published with Bristol, as well as some stuff that's kind of come out of the framework of analysis that we've formed through that. In particular, some recent papers and reports and stuff that, hope people will check out if any of this is interesting. I'll do my best to summarize some of it, but these are kind of the three key terms that I'm going to cover, again, to kind of keep myself also on topic. Technology in the context, especially of the monopolistic development of AI technologies that we are seeing take shape. Imperialism in the context of this kind of the unfolding great state, great power rivalries that we are seeing, especially across strong state industrial policies around AI and associated energy transitions, and the politics of dependency, right? The economic dependency, especially on powerful nation state powers such as the US, and how this is shaping, especially the infrastructure of AI, and also the pathways to resisting it, at least in my analysis. So this is just to say, I'm not going to do a lit review because I've got 10 minutes. So I'm just, just to say that we're drawing from a well of thinking around third world Marxists, developing dependency theory and dependency economics in the context of ostensibly decolonizing nation states in the global south in the mid 20th century, right? The idea that, with the gaining of flag independence, that does not mean that the relationships of colonialism just disappear, right? You have the reshaping of the capitalist world system in the context of especially the growing hegemony of U.S. as an empire, right? And its modes of sort of reshaping networks of trade in the mid 20th century, especially in the context of Marshall Plan and all this kind of stuff, post-war Reconstruction. And also the relationship of the former colonies to the colonial powers, right? And the way that this dependency requires an analysis of how imperialism takes shape in the aftermath of so-called, flag independence, right? And how this, shapes economic pathways, right? So, in the work that we've been doing in Ireland is that we are thinking about and drawing on also a somewhat more limited well of dependency theory in Ireland that was attempting to think about how, the institutions, how the economic model that folks might be aware of in Ireland, where Ireland is essentially a tax haven for these companies at the minute, develops in the context of this specific moment in the mid 20th century, especially Ireland's, sort of attempts to reduce its economic dependency on Britain, sort of linking itself with the US in the mid 20th century through a model of what was called industrialization by invitation, or FDI-led economic development, whereby, again, folks will probably know that Ireland is a tax haven, but this is also embedded in the infrastructure of the state, right? The entire industrial model, the model of industrialization, is based on inviting companies in, oftentimes building out the infrastructure and the kind of the resourcing that they need, right, from water to energy, in order for these companies to build out, right? And that is sort of a prehistory of the data center phenomenon here, right? Now, in this context, in the book with Paddy Bresnahan, we develop a concept of a post-colonial ecological regime, right, where we have in this context of a dependent economic model, dependent on investment mostly from the U.S., but also in large part from Europe after Ireland's accession to the EEC in the early 1970s, where Ireland comes to act as a platform for investment by big US companies into Europe. And you have basically the reorganization of Ireland's resource economies, of its infrastructures, of its energy systems, towards the support of, basically organizing the ecology of Ireland towards the, accumulation pathways of big multinationals, right? A good example of this might be, let's say, a factory built in, for example, a place like Mayo, where the entire water system is developed in the context where it has not previously been developed in order to invite a large Japanese multinational in this case for chemical manufacturing. But perhaps more pertinent to our analysis is that the kind of whale that was landed in the late 1980s, which was seen as the kind of birth of the Celtic tiger, let's say, or at least one of the factors in the birth of the Celtic tiger, was when Ireland lands Intel, right? And this was basically that Ireland was kind of bidding for Intel investment from, because Intel was looking to expand its manufacturing base in Europe. And basically, the whole point was that the state would develop the water systems, the energy systems, all of these, the road systems, things like this, in order for Intel to locate in Ireland, right? Not to, whenever I do these presentations, I end up giving a short history lesson of Irish economic development. So just to say, this has intensified drastically over the last few years, and especially since the financial crisis, right? We have, the boom and bust of the Celtic Tiger after the 2008 financial crisis. And then since then, Ireland has become exceptionally, some would say recklessly dependent on the corporation tax take from these multinationals for the basic functioning of the state, right? And again, you can get into some of these some of the figures, but this was called famously by the economist Paul Krugman, leprechaun economics, right? The way that Ireland was reporting economic growth, but alongside that was not actually any of the traditional metrics that would measure economic prosperity. Um, this to me, and I think to folks in this sort of frame of analysis, is the only way to understand how somewhere like Ireland has kind of become this canary in the coal mine for data center growth and development, right? People might know that data centers use 22% of Ireland's electricity. This is an astronomical figure. There's nowhere on the planet that at a national scale, this is the same figure. In Dublin, they're now using up to half of all electricity in the capital. So we have this extremely intensified dynamic that makes basically no sense, right? Where you're kind of looking at that and saying, well, why is this much energy? Why is this much infrastructure being directed to this one sector of the economy, right? And you can only understand this in the context of these relationships of economic dependency and Ireland's position as a facilitator in the world system for these dynamics, right? So, and just kind of, I think, where to maybe expand this in the context of artificial intelligence and, sort of where Europe is kind of developing around this, that where Ireland is instructive, is that the infrastructure upon which AI is dependent, right? You'll see the word dependency getting thrown around a lot in the context of cloud dependency and things like this. And I think it's instructive to apply the framework of Marxist dependency analysis to this dynamic of infrastructural dependency, right? Because again, I don't think I have the figures here. It might be in the next slide. There we go. The big three, right, account for basically most of the infrastructure as a service market in Europe, right? So you have this kind of push in Europe, the Draghi report stuff, like we need to develop a sovereign or at the very least competitive AI market in the context of the dueling powers of the US and China. The infrastructure on which this is being built and that it must necessarily be built by even their admitted models is completely owned by the US, right? And this is something that is not being meaningfully addressed in any way. And it is also completely constraining and oftentimes extremely cynical ways any kind of gesture they make towards sustainability, towards climate action, towards any of these things, right? Because on the one hand, these companies are deleting their sustainability commitments, net zero commitments to net zero, climate pledges, all of these things. These are basically disappearing from the websites, from the copy, even though they are also necessarily they need to secure energy supply, right? Data centers, that is the kind of business model basically is securing energy supply.
Apologies,
And
Patrick. One more
well,
minute.
cool. I'll wrap up here just
Okay.
to kind of point towards some analysis that I think is useful. The Scott theorist Elias Alami has been talking about, state capitalism in this context of like, especially kind of big, the US, for example, investing heavily directly into the economy, right? In a way that sort of is a step change from the basic neoliberal idea of non-intervention, right? But again, we know that, a neoliberal state is operates in order to support capital, right? But this kind of direct state intervention, Elias Salami has talked about the kind of AI wars that are being fought across these countries, right? And these kinds of resource grabs, this kind of race to develop the infrastructure, race to develop the technology, the chip capacity, the energy capacity, all of these things. He talks about this as a kind of imperial state capitalism, right? Where you have the shoring up, especially of in the US, right? You have these investments into these huge AI factories. Europe is kind of modeling a similar thing in a way that I think is really useful to see from Alami's standpoint, which he calls this what is effectively an irrational allocation of resources by any conceivable metric of what a state is providing in the context of any kind of public provision, right? And I think that we can take this into, and I'll kind of end on maybe a wishy-washy what is to be done here. We of course have movements that are pushing against this, that are tying this to this imperialist expansion and investment in AI within these kinds of great power rivalries, right? And I think there's a lot of really great grassroots stuff happening in Ireland that I'm happy to talk about in these contexts. But there's also these kind of gestures towards alternative models of industrial development, right? There's a great report from Cecilia Recap and some colleagues about a kind of progressive approach to digital policy that's not just let's, onshore everything to Europe and, screw the global south, whatever, right? And then also how this might tie to green industrial policy by folks like Jason Hickel, right, who's been writing a lot about this. So again, happy to talk about what these things might look like, but I think that this is the only way to kind of think through these contradictions is at a kind of level of, not just grassroots resistance, but also a kind of planning, right? What does a planned, sort of transition look like, especially in the context of these, sort of large scale rivalries? So I'll stop there and sorry for going a bit.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Patrick. That was a really alarming and beautifully illustrated presentation. I was particularly struck by your metaphor earlier on about the country as a platform, as a site for capital. Just to kind of clarify that a bit. So, part of your analysis rests on the idea of the US as an imperial nation that is effectively using big tech, digital corporations in order to enforce its dominance. Yeah, something along those lines. But when you describe, as you did there, it's almost kind of a comprador class in Ireland who are acquiescing with that. Yeah, you want to say a
Yeah,
little bit more about that?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the terminology that we use in the book, and that others like Conor McCabe, who's a political economist here in Ireland, would use in thinking about, especially in the context of dependency theory and dependency analysis, is this domestic bourgeoisie that acts as this kind of mediating force, right? And again, it's not as kind of I think cut and dry as a specific like class of people, right? There's some shadowy people who are handing envelopes back and forth, right? That's not what it actually looks like. This is actually embedded in the way the state operates, right? Is to support, and where again we see this kind of developed, through the infrastructure in Ireland, right? There's a lot of discussion in Ireland at the minute where in spite of us being one of the wealthiest economies on the planet, why is it that infrastructurally, in terms of public services provision, we are very, very low on most of those kinds of development metrics? And again, a lot of the reasoning for that is basically that the economic model has been gambled on this kind of inviting this investment in, right? And I think that I should just say I didn't really get to it there. This isn't to say that Ireland is just exploited, right? This is Ireland is playing an active facilitating role in especially some of the most harmful mechanisms of this in the world, right? Where, for example, there were data centers here that were hosting surveillance data used by the Israeli state to target Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, right? So there's this actively facilitating role that is happening because of this economic model in a way that I think, yeah, kind of requires, in the context of Ireland, this kind of wider analysis and contestation, but also I think it speaks to yeah, maybe some of the pathways that we have in other places to, yeah, sort of, yeah, find these pressure points maybe to resist these things. But yeah,
Yeah. Hopefully, we'll get on to talking about resistance in some of the questions later. But thanks ever so much, Patrick. That was a really alarming and fascinating talk. Dan, do you want to share any slides or are you going to busk it? You're sharing. Okay, you're still muted, Dan.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah. Yeah, just fine. Thank you.
Great. And you can see the slides?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, thanks very much for the invitation to be part of the webinar alongside brilliant colleagues and brilliantly chaired, of course. I'm hoping to gain a few seconds there at the end on that basis. So yeah, colonialism isn't my main axis for analysing things. You can probably guess what it is from the subtitle here. But, I think Amos Césaire put it well when he mocked people's surprise at the Gestapo showing up when they'd long tolerated barbarism being applied to non-European people. So, I think there's a really indivisible connection here. But I want to define what I mean by AI first before I go along to criticize it, because it can mean anything to anybody. And I specifically mean technologies built on neural networks, including transformer models and so forth. And I say that because I think, well, I hope it'll become clear. But for starters, this is a tech that uses correlations without causation, drives superficial pattern finding and stochastic text generation. Iran already went into the problems a little bit. I would describe this as severe epistemic cynicism. Also, there we go. There is an actual fundamental correlation or overlap or convergence really between these operations and the operations of race more broadly and more historically. And actually, before I go any further, I wanted to mention, because I know that my friend and colleague Mustafa Ali is on here, and if you want somebody who has spent a lot of time dealing with the issues of colonialism and race around computation technology, please check out the ideas around algorithmic racism and fugitive decolonialism and irresistible. So I wanted to say that this correlation on superficial differences and an active obfuscation of structural causes is exactly the purpose that racism itself serves in society. I've got more there, but I'm going to cut it because I'm afraid of the chair. So I wanted to move on to so that's one overlap, right? One overlap is race. Race is the fundamental technology, racial segregation and obfuscation of structural factors. That's a fundamental AI, colonial AI aspect. The second is obviously eugenics, because eugenics was developed by Galton and Pearson to provide a biological justification for the British Empire. And actually, it's not just that the I in AI is the I of IQ, is the I of eugenics. It's also that the operations of AI itself repeat this kind of stratification and provide solutions or solutionism that recapitulates eugenics, both broadly and globally speaking, but also in terms of even, the functions of the welfare system, the way disabled people are dealt with in society. On the periphery, of course, unleashing the kind of necropolitics that's been briefly referred to. And the third dimension of AI and its resonance with colonialism so strongly in its operations is expansion, because you all know about AI scaling. And I think that's been, the materiality of it has been covered already by Iran and Patrick. I just wanted to say that because it's a point that I want to get to, that this imperial pattern of relentless expansion built based on a kind of Promethean technology is what's being repeated in AI, and is equally bogus. So in kind of in relation to what Patrick was saying about Ilias's article on pure state capitalism, I wanted to draw some parallels between the operations of AI as an assemblage, the AI corporations and so on, and the East India Company. The East India Company, this explicitly geopolitical corporate entity, which basically led to the British colonialization of India. We've now got Palantir calling for a union of the state and the software industry because, according to them, some cultures have produced vital advances, others remain dysfunctional and regressive. And I think they're really just speaking for a lot of the AI assemblage. And just like the East India Company, this rollout of AI is very much an attempt to recursively bring parts of the globe back under a single set of ordering protocols. You could also say that the network states, which might not be familiar to people, but this is a fantasy of the tech bros at the moment, is really a kind of direct repeat of the idea of the East India Company. It's this adventurous expansionism. But this is where we want to pivot. There's actually a massive contradiction here, because although, and Patrick said it as well, that the AI is involved in incredible acts of violence, it is able to harm people. I would say that because of the things that Iran was mentioning, its essential shoddiness and shakiness, essentially, as a reliable technology, makes it very unreliable in social contexts. And I just want to ask, what's going on when this huge effort to sort of re-empire, in a way, is launched on the back of an essentially shoddy technology? So the answer I'm proposing at the moment, I propose today, is that this is really what Gramsci would have called a morbid symptom of the interregnum. There's a kind of generalized breakdown, systemic breakdown at the moment, and what AI represents is not an actually incredibly world-changing technology, but it is the convergence for a lot of powerful forces who are all desperate to try to hold on to power under these very changing conditions, which they have no control over, but for whose polycrisis they are entirely responsible. So they're kind of desperate for something that will keep the power going, will also distract people from the crisis they've created. And I think what AI really does is reveal the underlying nihilism of their attempts to do that. So I would say I see AI really as a diagnostic here, hence the medieval diagnosis diagram. And we should try to figure out what a decolonial approach to this technology would look like. On that end, I'd like to have a dig at a couple of things that I think are masquerading as decolonial AI. And one of those, I think, is something I see referred to quite a lot now as frugal AI, which is something mostly based on this idea of small language models, which I think are largely a form of deception, actually. I don't think that there are really models that have solved this problem of doing this neural network bullshit, I was going to say, I won't say that out loud, and, solving the problem of scaling. I don't think that's real, but also it's very clear from these projects that they're pitching AI as a form of solutionism for the same things that's being done here, and I say the UK, solving the problems of education, solving the problems of healthcare, and diverting, as it is in the UK increasingly, from an increasingly authoritarian government. And I'd also like to have a dig at the idea of AI sovereignty, because of this idea that somehow waving national flags over the top of your data centers is going to mean that it's characterizing European countries as the sort of plucky resistance to AI imperialism, even though they are still imperial and colonialist powers. It's just completely ridiculous. And what it is doing, is amplifying the same nationalisms that will lead to this technology being used, whatever its actual accuracy or efficacy, as the machinery of mass deportation, as the populist governments take over. So, so just on a side swipe there. Onto the matter of actually decolonial AI, I'd like to say that it also involves a decolonization of the mind. And this is not waving away colonization, but really trying to tackle this underpinning belief in technological progress, which you can hear every time a critic of AI says something like, starts their criticism by saying, oh, well, of course, AI has great potential for X, Y, Z. People can't let go of this idea that this must still be progress, because this is technological progress. And I'd just say, well, we really don't need to build local or decentralized versions of the torment nexus. We just don't need this colonial techniques, right? We need to do something else. And I'm calling that thing at the moment is what I'm calling decomputing. What do I mean by decomputing? Well, first off, the growth thing that we've all referred to. So I'm pitching decomputing as something that is aligned with, assimilates or assimilated to the idea of degrowth. So that's really trying to reduce this drive for limitless expansion. And I think people are grappling with this a lot right now. The great thing is, and that's drawing in the climate movement and so forth, the great thing is that people are very aware about this stuff, and that fight is on. And I think another fight that is on is the one against the, what I say for decomputing is, not a very catchy term, de-automatization, by which I'm trying to say we need to extract ourselves from the patterns of machinic relations which are amplified by tech, but are really amplifying the machinic relations that are already present in our well, very much in our institutions and systems. And I think you can see that. I don't know if anyone saw the brilliant video of students circulating the last few days, booing somebody at their presentation ceremony for starting to talk about the industrial revolution of AI, because young people at least really get it, right? This stuff is messing with our heads, and we need to get out of it. I'd just like to mention the idea of de-deification as well, because I think that is really just making us transparent to the thingification, that's a Césaire term, that's inherent in the logic of the computational state. So anyway, what do we do?
Sorry, Dan, 2 minutes?
Thank you. Sorry, 2 minutes, did you say?
Yeah.
So conviviality, that's one thing I'm trying to center this idea of decomputing around, because I'm sure it can be expanded and improved, but I think Illich did a pretty good job actually back in the 1970s of talking about this kind of, where we need to start the kind of planning that Patrick was talking about from in relation to technology, which is taking a step back and really trying to define what it is that would be the technological infrastructure of a good society, and then how we start to develop it. So it's not, we're not getting away from technology, but it is getting away from, definitely from forms of technology we've got, definitely from AI. And also pointing out that we can't do that without doing all the other things. I mean, Iran was really emphasizing the systemic nature. We need to have more sociocratic institutions if we're going to have more essentially democratic technologies. I have, written and talked a lot about this idea of people's councils and workers' councils. There are specific examples historically in the book. I put the Lucas Council. Now I'd recommend people go and check out the GKN factory occupation in Italy. Those are all actually tackling head-on the crises of militarization, precaritization, and climate change, and doing it in a way where they're trying to plan technosocially. They're doing a technological and social planning at the same time. And I think this is essential. I think we need to draw on the experience of infrastructure and care under emergency conditions, whether that's emergency as immigration raids or whether it's a hurricane recovery. So I think that AI is resisting AI is a decolonial activity, and that AI can only be resisted from a decolonial perspective. I think it's not a good thing, but I think one thing that AI is doing for us at the moment, AI is clearly a form of imperial overreach. It makes it very obvious that the rest of us are completely expendable. and that the only guardrails we can rely on are not system prompts, but forms of community defense. So I think anti-colonial forms of technosociality can really only come about starting from the periphery in whatever way we mean that. And I like the example of the Zapatistas because they did fuse a very sort of urban core leftism with indigenous life worlds, and I think that is really where the potential strength of something like decomputing lies. In any case, cracks are opening up. In a side reference again to All in Right, although I didn't draw it from that directly. The question I'd like to leave people with is, can we turn the interstitial, which is in the cracks, into forms of infrastructure in time for a livable future? Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. That was fantastic. Again, I just apologize in advance because not only have I squeezed the three speakers when they had so many interesting things to say, but also we've got some fascinating questions in the chat and 130 participants. And this is clearly an issue we need to spend more than an hour on. But nonetheless, we've got 13 minutes left for questions. So can I I'm just going to read some of the questions from the chat because that's probably the best place to go, really. So first one for you, Iran. If AI is structurally tied to capitalism, why should anti-AI struggle remain organized specifically around AI? Wouldn't the broader political task be to consolidate struggles against AI, climate destruction, poverty, and labor exploitation into a more unified anti-capitalist movement?
Right. So yeah, this requires me thinking a little bit more. But so the short and obvious answer, yes, of course, these things are related. But the problem is, in reality, when there's a campaign or the political effort is more focused, there is a high chance of being successful. So one of the most successful contestation against AI is data center because it's quite obvious what it is. It's a physical thing, it's there. And regardless of what part of the political spectrum you are, whether you think that the capitalism is bad or is good, you don't want that. And it's there. I think that it's not an abstract theoretical thing. It's actually in front of you, and I think I agree with the diagnosis, and I think you can't. So the problem is, yeah, I would be really try to be short in my response. The problem is if we don't do connected to this various aspect that is mentioned in the question, that if you resist a data center here, you may end up data center somewhere else, or you may end up another form of, a violence posed by AI. Hence, the coordination and the scaling up of different type of resistance is an absolute necessity. However, for the local campaign or a local form of resistance to be win is, I think, history shows us you need to be like focused on your aim.
Thank you. Dan, did you just respond to the reference to your colleague Mustafa?
Yes.
Yes, you did. That's great. Thanks very much. Patrick, can I just pitch you this next question, which is about pedagogy? And I was just thinking about, as an Irish academic teaching in Ireland, do you have particular kind of pedagogical strategies for thinking about this? And I suppose particularly in the context of universities, which I'm sure in Ireland, just as in the UK, are increasingly breathless about AI.
Yeah, I think I'll just say a couple of brief things about university and then because I really like that question because I think it's something that everyone's grappling with, in the context of like how do you actually teach and then, with like as I think anyone who's teaching in the university at the minute knows that, most written work you're getting back is, pretty much slop, like AI, not most, but a lot of it is at the very least AI assisted, no matter what you do really. But in that context, I think the university, obviously, I work at UCD. The 2030 strategy that they announced last year is completely orientated around AI, right? We're going to be a leading AI university, whatever. But then, myself and some of our cohort of more critical AI people, we tend to get the invites to these meetings about what that looks like tend to go missing, So I think that's an interesting aspect also then of how we're trying to teach this, right? Where there's a lot of contestation, even within schools, within colleges, whatever, about like how you actually, kind of manage this within your teaching. And I think that, the one thing that it's sort of led to, which I think is kind of a positive, is at the very least, like, there's a lot of people who are going real like AI police assessment stuff. But I think that the way that I've found most productive and stimulating for not just me, but I think, that I think is also a good sell to people is just kind of doing in-person stuff, right? And as silly as that, and basic as that sounds, as you're saying, like you can bring in Freire, you can bring in, bell hooks, and, you can sort of do the kind of pedagogical theory, but it's really just that kind of like, going, removing these as much as possible. And then the other thing that I would say, and this is kind of outside of the university type of stuff, like especially because, a lot of, as I'm sure, again, a lot of us are involved in a lot of things outside of the university in terms of the politics of these things. There's a lot of like interest in, sort of popular education, political education, things like this in a lot of, let's say cooperatives that you might be a part of, or, environmental groups that are stuck fighting these kind of constant campaigns of reaction against the next project that's coming to extract and that's coming to, sort of develop over them and things like this. These types of spaces are, kind of where at the minute, I think we're finding quite a lot of, again, conviviality, a lot of the, yeah, a lot of the most, let's say, nourishing work that, I've been doing and that I know a lot of my colleagues and comrades have been doing is in these kinds of political education spaces, right? Sort of, especially around AI, where it's quite abstract to people and kind of thinking through, like, okay, we have a local data center campaign. What does this mean in the context of these wider systematic dynamics? How do we connect with campaigns outside of Ireland, right? That can't just be done, from, this kind of constantly reacting. It has to come from long-term, sort of like popular, and collective political education that I think has been, at least for me, the most, yeah, nourishing thing, as much as I hate to say it, as being someone who works in university and sees value in this, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, all of us panelists are in higher education, employed by higher education, and I suppose lots of the audience are too. So let's just expand on this a bit. Dan or Iran, do you want to say anything about kind of pedagogy in the university and AI? I'm mindful, say, University of Bristol was AI University of the Year 2 years ago and has a gigantic shipping container with a massive computer called Isambard, and we're all supposed to be excited and grateful. Dan, Iran, any comments on the university?
I mean, they're all doing it and they're all sacking hundreds of academics. Seems like a curious coincidence.
Hmm.
You know, if we're sort of imagining ahead, and I posted the Instagram of the students in the chat for anybody who's interested. Yeah, I think the idea of learning in general will be reclaimed. And it's not just AI. Obviously, we've had these two outages of learning management systems over the last, I don't know how many months, 10 months or so, which have completely, brought down large chunks, at least, of the US education system. You know, we just need to basically get as much tech out of the education system as possible. I think that's basically it. And that might mean a re-establishment of the education system per se, but since it's busy in the UK, at least eliminating itself, that seems like probably a necessity, not just a nice to have.
Mm, mm. There's a question here, which again I'll pitch to all of you, see if anybody wants to go there. But basically, the person says that people tend to see devices and so on as being authoritative solutions, and they can't see beyond the black box and so on. So the question is, how do we start getting people to become active consumers again, rather than passive ones? Any thoughts about that? Any of you?
Well, I
Around.
mean, I don't have a deep thought on this, but I think I would a bit push back around the idea. I think this question is a good question. But push back around the idea of how individually each person can change their behavior regarding to AI-driven technology. We know very well from the environmental activism how, individual guilting, turn off the lamp or whatever doesn't work. And we need a collective solution. It sounds a very boring answer, but it doesn't work. And normally when my friends comes to me, they know what I think about AI. Is that, oh, we don't, but I'm sorry, but I use AI. I feel myself like as a priest that people, come and confess to me, and then I have to tell them, oh, it's fine. But I think there is a problem when the people, it's not about individual guilt. It's precisely about systematic usage of AI in our education and how we axe that. It's not about I mean, there is a problem with the individual usage, but I don't think should be our entrance to our, critical AI movement or critical AI activities we do. That's how much I can.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you said suggests that you have faith in a collective politics, not an individualist politics. So yeah, I guess the answer has to be something about collectivity, doesn't it? Sam Poskett asked, and that's quite a nice one. I'm going to pitch this to Patrick, so he hasn't said anything yet. I've been accused of creating a culture of shame by raising critiques of AI in my workplace. How would you respond?
Join the club, it's and I've heard this. Again, I think a lot of people have this, and you're kind of just referring to it there as well, Iran. I think I mean, ultimately, I'll speak maybe a little bit more personally and bluntly, and then maybe more systematically, that I think people should feel more shame about using, just in that context of like in academic workplaces, especially, right? When people are like, oh, I actually use it, to write things. It's like, I don't know. I don't feel bad about telling people like you shouldn't be doing that. That's ridiculous, right? It's not even gonna qualify it. But then thinking kind of more systematically, um, I think there is something to, and something that's helped me a lot is thinking through this idea of monopoly power, right? Which again, kind of there's a lot of crunchy Marxist writing about this in, 70s, 80s, even before whatever, about the, theories of like demand control, for example, right? That comes with this sort of monopolization and the kind of process of monopolization where even if we're looking at, the fact that, we're kind of locked into this, that, you can, try do all these complicated ways of turning off the AI agent, do all these whatever. This is about controlling demand, and that goes to the consumer level, right, of keeping you on it, making sure you use it, all the way, to the fact that they're like lobbying governments, telling them that it's going to be your fault when the AI bubble crashes if you don't force adoption across the civil service, across, invest into companies that are developing this on our tech, all these kinds of things, right? So I think that sort of, and even just thinking a little bit more systematically, I don't know what the solution, that how you kind of contest something as abstract as demand control, but it's that thing of, sort of thinking about these pressure points, right? Again, data centers, as you were saying there, Ron, is great. This even like kind of the like these more nourishing aspects of like decomputing, right? Degrowth, kind of environments where people are actually, kind of developing these alternative spaces where you can think about tech differently. I think this is something that is, yeah, but probably a little bit more useful at the very least, right? Where again, the shame might be part of it, but it's also kind of pointing people towards, well, maybe, like we're doing here in the chat, just sharing these resources, sharing ideas, and kind of, yeah, that would be a little bit more helpful on my end. But
Yeah. Marvelous. Thank you, Patrick. That's terrific. Any last thoughts from Dan or Iran before I bring this to a close? And I'm really sorry to do so because there's loads more things we could be talking about right now. Dan, do you
Yeah,
want to
I
make
mean,
a...
I just put a pitch in to follow what Patrick was saying.
Mhm.
I agree really about the points of shame, but I just think, the question is and isn't about AI. It's about, I'd very much like to say, what is AI telling us about everything else, really, and about the current moment in particular? And so I think the action isn't really like, do I use AI? Don't I use AI? I mean, I wouldn't. I think it's a bad idea for all the reasons that Patrick said. But I think we've got a lot more to worry about. And AI is a symptom of that.
Mm. Yeah.
And also a
Which,
guide, also a guide to what to do about
yeah,
it.
yeah. No, nicely put. Iran, do you want a final words? No, okay. So
Yeah,
there's a
I
lot
just
of...
want to say, yeah, I think there was one question in the chat I'm not going to answer really like. So I
Mm,
think big computer scientists, I think we have to, it sounds quite obvious that the technology is neutral, but I think we have to be and have an understanding of that every aspect of AI, not only the ownership, not only the infrastructure, but also the algorithmic itself. And a lot of people, including Dan here and then some of the other reference was in my talk. And I think that from academic point of view, is also very important to focus that, okay, it's a very common in the left is, okay, if we change the ownership of big tech, we're gonna have to live happy ever after regarding AI. And I think my last thing is that's not going to be the case, in my opinion.
Okay. It was all going so well. All right. Thank you, everyone. That was we just didn't have enough time. There was so much good stuff in there. And thank you ever so much to Iran, to Patrick, and to Dan. I've been Martin Parker, University of Bristol. I think that any attendees are going to get an email which has got some kind of 50% off coupon, as well as a recording, because there's loads of good stuff in the chat as well, lots of links to various things. So thanks everybody for attending. That was wonderful, and well, have a good day, the rest of you. Thanks very much.
Thanks to
Bye-bye.
Martin for chairing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Pleasure.
you. I
No, it was a
really
real
enjoyed it.
pleasure.